Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, we're going to be talking about a topic that was brought up between a friend and I recently. We were talking about some of the differences between Path of Exile and Last Epoch, and something actually came to light that we realized that is probably going to cause a little bit of issue for 1.0. And that's mainly due to the difference in the amount of content that there is for Last Epoch currently as it stands for the end game versus Path of Exile. What do I mean by that? Well, in Path of Exile, you have a lot of endgame content because the game has been out for a very long time and they've done a very good job in giving you more things to do. Like, for instance, when I get a build to endgame, I can fill out my atlas, I can farm different strategies, I can refine my atlas tree, I can push to uber bosses and stuff like that. I can do a lot of things with my build. But then if you look at Last Epoch, right, from the lens of Path of Exile, and you'll see that like there isn't that much content. So, like for instance, there is of course like pushing empowered monoliths and corruption, right? There is the three dungeon bosses, which are kind of a joke currently for most good builds, right? And then you have Arena, which has its own retinue of problems, right? So like you don't really have nowhere near as much content to actually play your build in, because one of the more important things in an ARPG, I think, is having things to do with your build. Like for instance, I was playing like Grim Dawn recently, a while back, and after I got to end game with my build, it's like there was not really much to do, right? Like you could like do the Crucible and stuff like that, but after that, there wasn't really much to do with my finished character, quote unquote, right? And the same thing kind of applies to Last Epoch. Now, of course, we do have a little bit more end game than that. Like I said, we have corruption pushing, but that's innately flawed for a few reasons. So, the first thing I want to bring up is the reason why we're even talking about this is because me and my friend were talking about content for Last Epoch versus Path of Exile, right? And he pointed out, rightly so, that he saw that I had a very large amount of uploads recently for Last Epoch, right? So, like for instance, I've played a bunch of different builds. It's like, well, did you spend much time on each of those builds? And I was like, yeah, I did. But the thing is like when it comes to making builds in Last Epoch currently, it does not take anywhere near as much time investment as in Path of Exile. In Path of Exile, I could easily play a build for 2 weeks and still not say it's done because there's still more things to do with it, still more content to do, and still more theory crafting and like refinement I can do for the build, right? I can put multiple mirrors of investment into my build and still have more things to do with it. Well, with Last Epoch, at least for realistic standards, right? There's only so much you can do with your character, right? You can only get such a decent amount of gear. Like you could technically get that 2 LP Twisted Heart, right? If you farmed enough. But that's not really in the realm of realism. Right now, Last Epoch has this really weird boundary where, like, after a certain amount of gear, the amount of effort it takes to get to the next step of gearing is significantly higher than the last one. So, like for instance, it might take like 4 days to get a build functional and doing well in like 500 corruption easily, or 700 or 1,000. But then to get the gear to push your character even higher to like 2,000, 3,000 corruption or something like that, it would take months, like actual months. And that is because of the rarity of the LP system and how double exalted items drop and stuff like that, right? Like the odds of you dropping a double exalted item are very low as it is, and then dropping a double exalted item that's even usable, like that's even significantly lower than that, right? Which means that there is a kind of a zenith in terms of gearing for your character in Last Epoch before like the grind becomes absolutely enormous. I'm talking like huge. So you have it really easy to get 90% of the way there, or 80%, and then the rest of the 20% is almost near impossible to achieve with most characters, right? In a decent time frame, especially in like a 3 month season. So you have this weird dichotomy of like, well, my build's finished, but it's not technically finished. But if I wanted to finish it, I need to go and quit my job and, quit all of my social gatherings and farm a Heart of Ulcrios 50,000 times for the attempt to get a 2 LP one, right? And then if I don't land that 2 LP one, well, then it's dead. So this causes the problem where like there is an absolute limit of which you can play your builds in Last Epoch, right? So I usually end up only playing a build for at least 2 days, right? Even maybe a little bit more depending if I push the corruption a little bit higher, right? But right now, as it currently stands, I asked the developers themselves, and I asked them like, which corruption are you guys like balancing at? Because obviously there's going to be a corruption rework, but certain amounts of corruption, right, with certain modifiers, it can get absolutely blatantly ridiculous, right? You can have void enemies deal 700% increased damage on your monolith or something stupid like that, which means that these modifiers aren't really balanced towards corruption pushing, right? And this has caused it so that generally most people, they don't push past a certain amount of corruption because the modifiers just get absolutely ridiculous. And if you're not pushing something bugged or broken, it makes it a little bit harder to actually push in a decent time frame because pushing takes a lot of time in terms of corruption. So I asked them, it's like, hey, are you guys doing anything to address this? And we got the conversation going a little bit, and they stated that right now, in terms of balance, they're balancing around like 300 is corruption. 300 is corruption is like where they would say like the difficulty of the game is like to the point where they would want it to be, right? This is what they're balancing towards, this is what they're balancing builds towards and stuff like that, right? Which means that like for me, it puts me in a really weird spot because um, I can make all my builds easily do 300 corruption like it's nothing, and I can push much farther than that. I can go 400, 500, 600, 700, or whatever it ends up needing to be, right? But at that point, I'm kind of just wasting time because if the developers are balancing the game around this specific amount of corruption, then like why am I playing like this build longer when I could just go do something else, right? What's the point? And it's not like as if there's any content that's keeping me playing the game for longer than like 500 corruption or something like that, right? So it really ends up becoming just like, when do I feel like the build is done? And I usually feel like 300, 400 is a great stopping point as it currently stands for Last Epoch, because that's about when you run out of like actual content per se. That's about when like the grind isn't so long that like it becomes absolutely boring, right? And that usually lands around 2 to 3 days. And they're like, oh, you're making builds pretty fast. Does that mean that you're like skimping on the quality much? Like, no, it's just right now in terms of Last Epoch, it's just too easy to make builds. It's too easy to get geared to that 90%, and it's way too hard to finish that 10% of gearing, which causes, like I said, this problem. So we're having this conversation even more, and we realized if a Path of Exile player came and looked at my content for Last Epoch and they see the amount of uploads that I've had over the past few months, and they see how many builds I pump out, I'm like, wow, in Path of Exile terms, if people was pumping out that many builds and stuff, they'd be like, wow, that's like a garbage content creator because, like he's spending only like a day on each build. Like in Path of Exile, like spending a day on a build you've barely started, right? But for Last Epoch, it's a little bit different because there's significantly less things to do with the content, right? With the builds that you want to play. So, for instance, right now, as it currently stands, to test a lot of things, to test a lot of nodes, that's what I've been doing a bunch. Um, you take a level 100 character that you already have that's already pushed corruption, right? Like I have a bunch of characters of each mastery, level 100 and like 500 corruption. All I need to do is respec the passive tree, respec the skills, and then go in my stash where I have 70 tabs worth of like exalted items, and then craft whatever items I need, slam whatever legendaries I need. And this process only takes like a day or two, and I can refine the build further, get better gear for the character, refine their blessings and stuff like that. But even then, even if I go out of my way to go even farther, right? If I don't level the character, right? If I just respec, it just takes like a day at most, right? And even if I leveled a whole new character and grinded a whole new gear piece set for the character, it would at most take like 3 to 4 days to finish a build in Last Epoch. At least for me currently, that's how efficient my pipeline has become. That's how efficient of a player I've become. So, like I said, if you come from Path of Exile, it's just really weird, right? You're like, wow, you're like finishing build so fast. But in terms of Last Epoch, that's like the average time because, like I said, when you do get your character done, there's just nothing to do with it. There's no pinnacle content for me to do. All I can do is push this number that ends up just becoming meaningless in the end because you end up corpse rushing through it anyways, like most people do. right? Like when people push like high corruption, like 1,000, 2,000 corruption, they're not doing it deathless. They're pushing and they're like literally just corpse rushing through it entirely because you will end up getting modifiers sometimes where like enemies will do like 2,000 increase in damage to you. And there's only so much you can do about that other than keep rerolling the dice of the monolith RNG until you get a monolith with like spiders in it. And then, of course, continue on. And at that point, it just becomes very similar to like Diablo 3, where you're fishing and stuff, which makes the corruption grind ultimately meaningless. Now, if you couldn't re-roll monoliths in the way that I'm talking about, then it wouldn't be that big of a deal. It'll actually, like, corruption pushing would actually make sense. But because of the fact you can fight Oribus as many times as you want and still get the same amount of corruption every single time, it means that if you die on an Oribus, you can just go back to the Oribus, go and try and kill him again, and then do it again and again and again until that one time where you do it. And then guess what? There's your 10 plus corruption. And then you do that again and again and again. And that's literally what a lot of these people do. They literally do this all day and then they end up at like 2,000 corruption all of a sudden. They're like, wow, dang, right? Or they're playing something like Rune Master, which is absolutely busted and shouldn't be used as an example of like actual balanced gameplay, right? That's like another big thing when it comes to these things, right? What'll happen is like someone will come in and they'll play something like the stupid broken like bugged lich with like 60 billion ward, right? And be like, oh wow, this is build's really good. And then they'll play like a normal build. I'm like, wow, this is really bad. I'm like, no, it's just because the other build was broken, right? Obviously. But all of this ranting is just me saying that, like, hey, Path of Exile has a lot more content than Last Epoch, which means that of course the lifespan of the game in terms of each build is significantly lower, meaning that you'll end up actually playing a lot more characters in the end, but you'll be doing significantly less content and time with each character because there's not really much to do. Now, of course, there are some people in the community, God bless their souls, that are actually trying to go for these items that are insanely overpowered, like force like a 2 LP, like Twisted Heart, double exalted affix items and stuff like that. But even some of the most dedicated people I know that are farming and have been farming for months still don't have anywhere near the gear that I'm describing. So they have this 90% stopgap that is keeping them from pushing farther that they can't really change because the game is built in a way where like that is effectively the limit, right? Now when trade comes and those items exist more often, maybe it's fixed, maybe it's changed, maybe with COF it's easier, but the problem becomes then if it's too easy to gear our characters, then like what about like actual retention of people playing the video game, right? Like are people going to grind and then like get to their gear cap essentially, right? Let's say like 95% gear perfection is the gear cap in the next patch, which would be a huge change by the way. If that happened, like what do they do with the character? Do you just keep pushing corruption? It eventually gets boring. Like pushing corruption is like probably one of the most boring things ever to do. That's why I never usually do it unless if it's a build that I love and I enjoy and I want to play a little bit more, and that's why I haven't really been focusing on it. Now, of course, when 1.0 comes, I actually do plan on pushing more corruption and actually like giving a damn about the system. But right now, as it currently stands, like no one really cares about it, meaning that, like, you know, like I said, you play a character, you get it all set up in like 4 days, and then you're done, and then you move on. For me, I've essentially made the system so efficient that like I can get a build out in like a day or two and be completely fine. Like for instance, the Flameburst Warpath character I played with no uniques, by the way, and I was doing like 400 corruption with it. It took me like a few hours to get that set up because not only have I played Flameburst before, but I had a level paladin in corruption with the right blessings. All I had to do was respec the character, which takes a total of 5 minutes, respec the skills, which takes a total of 5 minutes, and then go and craft some new gear pieces, which takes maybe 30 minutes to an hour, which is not that long at all. The biggest thing that stops me from making a bunch of builds for Last Epoch currently as it stands is the amount of glyphs of hope that I eat. I actually, most of like half of the time that I've been playing the video game has been me farming monoliths to get more glyphs of hope because I have been testing so many different build archetypes. I've been testing so many different builds that all of course fail because like 90 like I try a lot of things, right? Like I try everything I possibly can. Like for instance, I just tried a fire aura character again because I was curious like can we make fire aura good? Turns out no, fire aura kind of sucks, sure. But that's like 50, 60 glyphs of hope that are down the drain. And I got to go farm those again. It was like, well, Dread, I had like 1,500. Well, yeah, it's because you're not crafting like 5 builds a day, right? It's just like I'm using way more than your stereotypical average person because I'm trying way more builds than like anyone ever does, right? But yeah, that's pretty much my rant. Like I said, Path of Exile is hugely different in terms of the build economy than it is for Last Epoch. And I hope that people understand this point when 1.0 comes. Hopefully, we get some more endgame in 1.0, which makes it so that, the average build lasts a week or two instead of just a few days. Hopefully, that changes. We'll see. But with all that being said, if you haven't already, I'd heavily suggest leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel. I'm off to go do something else. Bye.